course, we call this practical preparedness principles. And I like to focus on the idea of using principles rather than just a list of stuff. Now, you heard about that in part 1 that we did previously. This is part 2, which I call creating your first parachute. And if you remember, we talked about parachutes last time. But as a very brief review, just for a few moments, I want to touch on 2 of the principles that are so important because I don't want you to forget these. Remember these and practice them. Now, in part 1, I gave you a lot of extra information, but these 2 are vital that you keep in mind. Number 1 I called what? And that is the law of provident living. And the law of provident living had 4 parts. This is a test, and so you can answer. And number 1 in that list of 4 was what? What was the most important thing? Okay, spiritual. That was the top of the list. Okay, what was number 2? I said this is the one that makes a difference between whether you live or die when things are really bad, when it all comes down around your ears. It can't get any worse, but it is. What will get you through is what? Okay, attitude. That's right, number 2. Now, I defined attitude as being the way that you emotionally respond or react to what's going on around you. That's the simplest definition, but very powerful, of what attitude is. The question is, how do I change attitudes? You don't change attitudes just by pounding on them. You change attitudes by number 3 on this list, which is what? Number 3 is knowledge. That's right. Knowledge is how you change attitudes, because when you know something and are comfortable with something, what is your attitude about that? Your attitude is, well, I'm okay. I can do this. I'll be all right. So number 3 is knowledge, and that's how we change our attitudes. And of course, number 4 I put at the bottom of the list, which is what? Yeah, stuff. I like to use the word stuff because it kind of de-emphasizes that. Now, we do need material things. They're vitally important, but we're going to call it stuff because you're not safe because of what you own. It's what's inside of your head, your heart, what's at your fingertips. So what a lot of people say, will you just tell me what to buy? Give me the list of what to buy, and then I'll be okay. And of course, you heard my answer to that already. I simply say, if I just tell you what to buy, when things really get tough, you're going to give up and die. So there's far more to it than that. Now, why is clothing first on the list? Well, remember this thing that I talked about in the first section? I said, if you're prepared for the worst, then no matter what happens, it will be an adventure. Okay? That's what it's about. I'm not a gloom and doom kind of a guy. I'm one of the most positive guys that you're ever going to see. But I want to take a look at how bad things could be, because I know if I'm prepared for them, then I'm going to be okay. And my attitude says that I can make it through this. All right. See, proper clothing is your personal portable shelter when you're out in the environment. It's something you can take with you. In severe weather, you can become injured and or die in just a few minutes, a few hours, a couple of days when it's really severe. Now, hopefully it isn't really severe when we have our incidents, but it could be. And I would like to be prepared for those. So the clothing parachute, now when we take a look at this clothing parachute, we have to consider, well, what are the conditions? Well, we have very mild conditions. Right now we're having kind of this Indian summer thing in the fall, and it's turned really warm and mild. And these kinds of conditions, I'll tell you what, if all of us had to live outside tonight and for the next 3 or 4 days, it isn't going to take anything special. It'd be a little bit inconvenient. But we're really not going to be threatened to be outside right now just in kind of standard clothing. So mild conditions, you just don't have a problem. And it's things like today, it's things like in the, the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and there's no bad weather, precipitation or anything. Now we can get into moderate conditions. Moderate conditions are where it starts to get a little colder or hotter, get into the 90s and plus, or the temperatures are down in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and let's throw in a little wind and rain and some of those things. Now that starts to becoming threatening. Certainly it's uncomfortable, but you could actually die in mild conditions, what you might think of being mild conditions. If it's 40 degrees, the wind's blowing and it's raining and you're stuck out in your shirt sleeves right now, and if you're out there for 2 or 3 days, you might not make it unless you start doing things with shelter and fire and other things. Well, if I just have the right clothing on, I don't care. Do you see how that works? But you get into the extreme conditions, and that's like falling out of a plane without a parachute on if you don't have the right clothing. See, the others are kind of like stepping off your front porch or maybe jumping off the roof of your house. You can probably do it and it's okay. It won't hurt you. But if we get into the extremes where the temperatures are now well below freezing, high wind, sleet, snow, into the extremes below zero, and you're outside, you must have the right clothing or you will be hurt very, very quickly. So we're talking about things like the heat. If you take a look at that one picture there, that was the desert experience that I told you about, and I love camping and living in the desert, but you've got to be prepared for that. It takes the right clothing to do that. And if you have the right clothing, you can be right out there. Other things are into the extremes of the cold, and these are some of the experiences that I enjoy doing out there, and it may be on mountain peaks in those areas where you can be in the extreme colds, and on mountaintops out there. That one picture, I'm standing in the wind, and it's 110 mile an hour wind, and it's 13, 14 below zero on top of an igloo in the Arctic. A beautiful place to be, but you've got to have the right clothing to be out there. A mountain peak in the extreme cold. That was 40 below zero in that picture. Waking up in the morning. Here we are getting up out of bed, and you see sleeping right outside, 40 below zero. In fact, it was 42 below zero that morning when we were getting up. Wonderful place to be if you have the right clothing. Now, I hear some laughs and people going like, oh man, this guy is nuts. Do you remember what I said? Remember that early on little statement that fits? You know, it's like if I know how to swim, doesn't make any difference how deep the water is. If you know how to stay warm, it doesn't make any difference what the temperature is, what the wind is. You will be just fine. That's what we're talking about tonight. All right? Now let's take a look at some moderate conditions type of clothing. You know, very often we're talking about emergency, somebody saying like a 72-hour kit is what you need. And they talk about these little evacuation packs and those things. By the way, I want to tell you that most of these kits are woefully inadequate. And as we go through this class, I think you'll understand why. You get one of these little $49.95 specials or $99.95 specials, and it's got all the Band-Aids and trinkets, baubles, and beads in there, and it's missing some very serious things that you may need. You will understand those things as we look at these parachutes. Now, you take a kit like this that is woefully inadequate, and then if I add to it some things like the clothing that's in here, now it starts to mean something. Now let's take a look at what we mean by some of this moderate conditions clothing very quickly. Now I'm going to have a thing, and I'm just going to dig out some things and we'll look at them real quick here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because I think you get it. It's a thing like, well, here's a coat and a parka that you may need. That's a very useful thing to have. Just a nice parka with a hood on it to go over top of my clothing. Now then, the rest of the things that I may need include some pretty standard stuff, and most of you will understand this. We've got a shirt and some pants, and I may have these things in here, a couple of changes of socks, some good tough socks. See, I'm not talking about extreme conditions right now, it's moderate. The kinds of things that you'd use off into the mountains. I've got a good sturdy pair of boots, something I can do some heavy traveling with. That's a very useful thing to have. And then another change of clothing, it may be like this. I've got some other things to help me out. A hat. Very important to have a hat in here. Sun visor, yeah, that would be nice, but for insulation, if it starts getting cool, insulating this head is extremely important, so hats are very, very vital to have. Another little thing that people very often miss that I believe is important in your survival supplies are things like these gloves. Very important thing to have. Not so much for staying warm, but as a tool. This protects my hands when I have to work out there. And think about this. If we're now talking about some kind of an accident, incident, earthquake, hurricane, tornado, whatever it is that busted things up, and you're now trying to dig through the rubble of your home to help either your family or find your stuff in there, we're talking broken glass, twisted metal, splintered wood. You do not want to be doing that in your bare hands. This is something that you should have in your emergency supplies all over the place. Very useful thing to have with you. There may be some wind garments and things like that. Now this is a beautiful little wind garment here, but it's also fairly expensive. Let's talk about some other things for a moment that fit in this moderate clothing type of things, and also some things that'll keep the price down. Now since I was just looking at this wind garment and a rain garment, I showed you previously, and we'll show you again how to make some of these things. Here's one made out of a trash bag with a hood on it made from a grocery bag, and with cords on it that are made from grocery bags and a piece of wood. And of course I've got a slit in it for my arms to come out. It's real simple. I mean, what is this? This is free. Well, I had to buy the tape, but you probably have some tape laying around. So things do not have to cost a lot of money if you'll get creative about how you make them. A hat, of course, again, is very important, particularly in the sun and in the heat. A big broad-brimmed hat becomes very, remember, you see all the pictures of the people way down south or down in Mexico in the big sombrero? Okay, that's to keep the sun off of you. That's clothing. Some other things that people don't think of as clothing is like sunscreen. That's clothing, that protects you. Also, insect repellents, that's clothing. That protects you from those biting creatures out there. And mosquito netting and things like that. Those things become clothing. I already mentioned the idea of these gloves is a very important, and windbreakers. You can have a poncho or rain slickers or things like this. Depends on your conditions, what you may be exposed to. You need things like that. Now that's all in this moderate clothing area. Now consider this. If I now have my survival, my little emergency kit, or maybe we have a little better one than that. I consider having something more like this, a real pack with some real stuff in it and things. I can build a pack, the stuff that goes into a pack that I can live out of for 6-8 weeks without resupply. And that allows me to be very independent if I want to. But there's something that's missing from that pack for the extremes as well as this. All that I have to do is now change the clothing into some of these extreme clothings that I'm going to show you. I can take a little bag like this, and if I put that with this standard clothing right here, I've now extended my range down into approaching 0 degrees. If I'm going to be below 0, then some of the extreme Arctic clothing we're going to talk about. But typically that's one of the things that is most missing from these emergency kits is clothing. And I'll give you another hint. Guess what else they don't have enough of? Water. That's the other thing, and how to replenish water. You start taking a look at those kits, they don't tell you anything about clothing other than they assume you have some. You know, get a coat. That won't take care of you in the extremes. And then we have the little issue about, people ask me on the space blankets, nice idea, but it will not really take care of you in the extremes. And if anybody doubts that, and I didn't say a space blanket is worthless, and if they're in the kits, that's okay, but you need to have the experience of knowing what they will do. So I suggest the first night that it approaches freezing, you go wrap yourself up in one of those space blankets without anything else and see what your night is like. And then that does not substitute well for a sleeping bag, let me tell you. Get some experience with those things. And of course, then water is the other thing. Now then, one of the things that you also need to consider in this clothing area, let me broaden your thinking about clothing, is what do you do at night? What is nighttime clothing? We call it bedding, don't we? That's all that it is. When you go to bed at night, you're going to have some clothing on. We normally think in terms of, well, I have pajamas on. No, the mattress that you lay on, the blankets you put over top of you, that's all clothing. It's just nighttime clothing. So that extends our need for emergency supplies into probably things you have like blankets already, which is great. But now then, what if we start getting into the cold? What if we have to be mobile? That's where the sleeping bag comes in. Wonderful thing to have. So you need to add this to your emergency kits and to your ability to be mobile out there. Now, as we take a look at, sleeping and bedding, you think, okay, this is just fine if I'm at home, but what do I do if I'm outside? How do you live out there? Well, we take a look at this audience, there's probably a number of people that have gone camping a few times. Now, some people said, yeah, I went camping once, and that was enough. I learned my lesson. Probably didn't have a lot of fun. Some of you, if I say, how many of you winter camp? We get a few hands out there, and you get some other people so like, yeah, I went once, and that was enough. Those things are painful. I'm not into pain. So we're going to show you some ways that you can be more comfortable. This is not about suffering. This is about being okay. All right, now bedding at nighttime. You have to have something to put it in if you're in the environment out there. So very commonly, we think in terms of having things like tents. And there's some nice tents that you can have. Here's an excellent little tent. It's a 2-man tent, a good 4-season tent. However, a problem that you have with tents, they can be very expensive. They're also fairly bulky and heavy if you're trying to backpack with them. There's some small little things like this bivy sack that I use. Now, that's just a little bag that you slip your sleeping bag and all your stuff down inside of. And so it's not very big, very small and compact and lightweight. That's nice. But you can have there's a little bivy tent like this. You see this pretty small little tent. This is a 1-man little creature. And it's not very big, but it's enough to shelter your bed. The challenge you have with all of these things, here's a little bivy sack, that's about $100. This is a bivy sack tent that's going to run, I don't know, $70 or $80. That really good tent over there, I talked about that mountaineering tent, you're around $300 for that tent, and quite frankly, You can tell if a tent's going to be any good usually by the price tag on it, unless you get some unusual deal. A $39 tent is rarely worth the matches to burn it down. They just will not hold up in the extremes of wind. In particular, wind is what tears them up. So there's a problem. You say, oh my heck, you know, there's 9 people in our family and I'm going to have to buy $100 for each one of them? Or let's say that take a $300 tent and that's, oh shoot, that's like $1,000. You know, what are we going to do? Because there's some other things you need to be spending money on. So let me give you a little hope right here that you can begin with some low-cost things. Now be careful about what people try to sell you on the idea of being low cost. Here's one of those things that is, can be a serious problem. We call them the tube tent. Now I'm not going to tell you that a tube tent is bad, it's just the idea of having a tube that you turn into a tent is bad. Think about this. If the conditions are mild like they are right now, there's no wind, there's no rain or anything, you don't need a tent. Let's suppose, when do you want a tent? When do I want some sheltering? It's cold, it's snowing, and the wind is blowing at 40 miles an hour. You'd love to have some way of getting out of that. So you have one of these tube tents. You ever seen one of them? You got these 2 ropes strung up between a tree, and then the tube goes around it. Ever notice that there's no ends in it? That means that the snow is going to blow right through that thing. It didn't do you any good. Now, if you have a tube tent, I didn't say throw it away, just don't turn it into a tent. Just use it as a tube, kind of in the way that I'm going to show you with a plastic sheet. Because here's another thing that you can do that will save you a tremendous amount of money when you're getting started. This is a plastic sheet. This is visqueen, is construction plastic. 4 mils thick, 12 foot by 12 foot square. I like using the natural, the clear. That is all that you need to wrap your bed in to take care of you in extreme cold, extreme wind, heavy rains. It works exceptionally well. Now what I need to do is, real quick, we're gonna go outside, and I'm going to show you how we fold one of these things up so you can see how it works, because if you understand how to fold this thing, it's a snap. Oh, by the way, what's the cost? $4 or $5 a person. That's quite affordable. And if you will take care of it, you can use it dozens and dozens and dozens of nights. So you see a roll of this stuff that'll cost you $30, $35, a 100-foot roll. You can get 9 pieces out of it. Divide that out. It's very inexpensive. Have 2 or 3 rolls. By the way, this is something that you want to have in your storage in case you have a mild earthquake that blows all the windows out of your house. And everybody lost all their windows, and it's the middle of January and the wind's blowing. There's no glass stores left. They fell down too. Well, you have some visqueen, you just cut that out, staple it over your windows, a little bit of duct tape, and close it up. So this is something not just for bedding outside, but it's a very useful thing to have around your house for repairs. Okay, let's take a look at how to fold this for a moment, so we'll go outside. Let's take a look at how you use a plastic sheet. This is so simple and so easy, and you really do need to try this out. You need to go play with this and have fun with it. And to you leaders of youth, Scoutmasters, Weeblo leaders, parents, I don't care who you are, I want to plead with you to not use a tent with your young people. It's a good idea you don't use one with yourself. The reason why is so simple. We have this attitude that says, I'm not safe unless I'm inside of something. So we have this idea, oh, if I put up a tent, I'm inside of it, the boogeyman can't get me. All right. This little thin piece of plastic-coated fabric isn't going to protect you from anything that wants at you. There isn't really anything out there that wants at you, quite frankly. So let's take a look at how we put this thing together very simply. What I'm going to do right now is, let me just lay this out. You'll see I fuss with it a little bit, but here I'm just one guy laying it out. And if the wind is blowing, I may have to put a little rock or a stick on it or something, but I can lay it out all by myself. And I've been out there in some horrific windstorms, and I've had to lay on it while I'm doing it, but it'll go together. Remember that picture I showed you? It was 42 below zero. We were waking up. That was Wolf Creek Pass, Colorado, in January, a number of years ago. And if you saw those people getting up there, they were nothing but a plastic sheet. So we'll use it at 40 below zero in the extremes of Arctic conditions. We'll use it in the summer where you have heavy rains. Now this isn't good for swamp camping, I'll admit that, but I don't camp in swamps, so I guess I'm okay. I'm going to take my sleeping bag. A couple of things. Number one, If I'm out there in the sticks and the rocks and the brambles, I'm not going to be walking on the plastic sheet. Punches holes in it, then they leak. So you walk around it. Lay my sleeping bag off to one side. Fold this side of the plastic sheet up a little bit. Then I will grab this side over here. Now I don't want to wrap it up real tight, but I do want to enclose this thing. I will bring it across the bag. And then all that I'll do is I'll just pick up on this side, as we used to say in the Navy, I'll lift up on it smartly. It sucks that plastic up underneath it. Tuck that underneath there, grab the foot, put it underneath. I'm laying on top of the loose ends. You can go through one horrific windstorm inside of that, and I have. You can bury that in the snow, in a slit trench. Use them inside of igloos, use them outside of igloos. Right out there when we were on our trip in 1968, the first Arctic trip up there, there we were, 600 miles north of the Arctic Circle. Highest temperature we ever saw was 10 below zero. Part of the time we were inside of igloos. It's a nice way to live. But we were also right outside, and we stayed right outside up there above the Arctic Circle. Now, a couple of little tricks real quick. They're not really tricks. You just have to understand this. First off, I hear some people talk about plastic sheets. Yeah, I tried sleeping in one of them things, and I got all wet. Okay, I always ask them, where'd you get wet? Well, in the morning, my sleeping bag was all covered with water. Well, yeah, you have a little bit of moisture that comes off of you, a little bit that you breathe out, and you get some condensation inside of that. That's probably a cup and a half, maybe 2 cups of water maximum. It's spread all over the inside of it, and it's like a big deal. It's on the surface. It's a teeny little bit of moisture. It's all on the surface. You open things up, and they dry out. Or people say, yeah, in the winter it freezes and it's ice. I know, it's ice, and it's on the inside of the plastic sheet, the outside of your sleeping bag. You just brush it off. It's just dust. It's dry. It's no big deal. But some people say, yeah, I slept in one of those things in a rainstorm. I got soaked. Where'd you get soaked? I was just wet all over the bottom. Well, if you don't have any holes in the plastic sheet, it won't leak unless you create a hole. This is what happens. Now, if I'm in nice weather, and I always like to make up my sleeping bag and put it in the plastic sheet anyway, because I've had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning in a rainstorm and make my bed up, and that's a hassle. So I'm going to go to bed all wrapped up with my head and face out, enjoying the beauties of the universe out there. But if it comes up raining a little bit in the night, you just pull this thing over top of you and you have a little rain fly there. Sometimes you have a stick or a rock or a piece of equipment here that holds it up off you, and it's just a little fly. Now then, if the wind starts blowing, you grab this thing and you tuck it up underneath you so it doesn't blow it off of you. But here's what happens with people that get wet. There they are, laying in this plastic sheet. The wind starts to blow and it's raining out there real heavy, so they grab the end of this plastic sheet, tuck it up underneath their head right here, so that it won't blow away, and they left this water collecting device deployed out here. And it picks up 3 gallons of water and puts it right under their bed, and they're soaking on the bottom. You see, it wasn't a problem with the plastic sheet, it was an operator difficulty. And so you just have to be sure that you have this little flap out here, that it's got to be tucked up underneath this thing too, or it's going to collect a whole bunch of water and put it in your bed with you. If you do that, you can go through some terrific rainstorms. I remember one that my son James here, our camera operator, we were up on one of these fathers and sons campouts, and the history of our campout was that every time we went, it rained year after year after year. And we were on one of those things out there, and it came up, and they should hire us for drought control, because when we would go out, it would just rain like crazy. And this was one of those where we went out there and it came up in the middle of the night and the lightning is firing off and it's just pouring down rain much of the night, all night long. We get up in the morning and I noticed that the place was about deserted. These people have been packing up and leaving in the night out there. The only people left that were dry up there were the folks that were in the campers or the motorhomes, and me and my boys in our plastic sheet on the ground, and everybody else in their tents had bailed out and went home because they got soaked. So we rode out a tremendous rainstorm up there and stayed dry. And James was one of those young guys up there with me, and I think we had 3 or 4 of his brothers up there too. It's cheap and it works extraordinarily well. So that's a place that you can begin. And how do you take care of your bedding in all kinds of conditions and temperatures? You can use the plastic sheet. Now, what does that mean? A tube tent, what did I say? Don't throw your tube tents away. That's a tube, sort of. That's just a tube that I folded up. Just don't try to make a tube tent into a tent. Leave the thing on the ground, tuck the foot up underneath, breathe out the end of the thing, and if it comes up blowing real heavily, tuck it down underneath you. Now somebody wants to ask, but won't you suffocate in that thing? And the answer is, well, so far I haven't. And let me give you a little more hope. I added up at one time the number of Boy Scouts and adults and young people that I myself have taken out and or my dad has taken out. We've done this many, many hundreds and hundreds of times, some of them large groups. And a number of years ago, when I gave up counting on this, it added up to something like 25,000 people nights in bedding wrapped up in plastic sheets. Haven't lost a one of them. Nobody has suffocated in them. I have had 2 of my Boy Scouts killed on the highways, however, that I know of. That's not exactly a fair comparison, but I just want you to understand it's not a very hazardous thing to do. Now then, I'll give you a little experience about that, however, was one time in the winter we were camping, because some people say, but you know, something might happen and you could suffocate in there. I'm going to tell you, you do not sleep through suffocation. That's one of those things that sets off the alarm bells in your head and says, this is wrong. Let me give you a personal example of that. One time, and this would have been back about 1967, and I had, when I was at university, and I had a Boy Scout troop and an Explorer post, and we went camping up in the Rocky Mountains outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico up there, and it was a nice cold winter night, probably 5-10 below zero. And we had one of those wonderful storms that came in the night. We made up our beds and got down on our plastic sheets and were having a good old time and sleeping away. Now, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I ask very basic questions like, why did I wake up? And so I woke up and I said, well, is something cold? No. Something else hurting? Something wrong? No, not really. And then I noticed that I said, it's stuffy in here. I was breathing a little heavier than I was used to. And I said, you know what? And I went, ooh, my heck. You know, I was laying, it had snowed 2 feet on top of us in there. And the plastic sheet had become sealed up and we were using up the oxygen in our beds. Well, I thought, oh, golly, I'm breathing heavy. Now, I kicked open the end of my plastic sheet and got some fresh air and said, that feels real good. And then I thought, oh boy, I got all these guys up here with me. And I figured out some time ago that it's really bad on my reputation if one of the people that's with me dies. And so I thought I better go check on them. So I crawled out of bed in this snowstorm that's going on out there and went around to check on my boys. And I found that every one of them, there was the end of their bed had been flipped out and the plastic sheet was thrown out and the snow was knocked back. They didn't sleep through that either. They woke up enough. Now, it was interesting because I asked them in the morning, I said, how many of you guys remember waking up in the night, you know, and kicking? They said, I don't remember that. You know, most of them said they didn't have any knowledge of it. They woke up just enough to take care of the problem, went back to sleep, and were just fine. By the way, sleeping under the snow is warmer than out in the cold air anyway, so that's a good place to be. Okay, what I have found is this, that for the extremes of winter and cold, most people are very poorly prepared. They have very little experience with these things. There hasn't been a need, and so they haven't done anything with that. And this is where I want to help fill in those gaps for you, because winter does not have to be threatening to you. Consider this idea. Why do winter experiences fail? The list is very, very simple. They fail because, number one, cold feet. How many people here have had cold feet? I don't just mean those little kind of chilly, cool, stinging things. I mean, how about when they throb and ache? Anybody ever had feet go numb? What was it like when they became unnumb? You wish they were numb again. That really hurts. So cold feet, now that'll blow the, I'll tell you what, pain is kind of hard on my attitude. I'm not into pain. So cold feet is hard on your winter experiences. The other thing is that people are not mentally prepared to deal with the cold. The fact that things are different, everything slows down out there, and you have to be prepared to deal with that. So part of it really is an attitude of being okay with the winter and with the cold. And then the other thing is, everything else gets cold, and I'm like, I'm out of here, send me home, I'm done. So what people learn is this, and the bottom line is simply people don't like pain, and once they've had enough pain out there, they simply go home, turn up the heat, and say, well, I've learned to never do that one again. So they don't. The realities of winter are this. Number one, winter can be uncomfortable. Very true. Winter can hurt you, no doubt about that. And as a matter of fact, winter, cold, and snow can be deadly. You have to be very careful with it. Now we're talking about, in terms of cold and winter, cold injuries. And what are those cold injuries? There's really only two that we'll talk about very briefly in this section. And one of them is frostbite. Very quickly to mention that, I don't know, frostbite, what is it? It's very simple. Frozen flesh. And if you don't understand that frozen flesh on your body is a problem, I'm here to tell you that it is. Now, it isn't so much the fact that the flesh is frozen, it's what happens after it warms up. In particular, if it's been damaged very heavily, and in particular, if it's been frozen, thawed, that flesh is dead. It cannot be recovered. And it will die. And if you do not have proper medical attention, that stuff literally rots on your body. It becomes very septic and it poisons you, and you can die from the infections that ensue after frostbite. That's the biggest problem with frostbite. Now then, the other threat in winter is hypothermia. Hypo means depressed or lowered. Thermia is just temperature. We're talking about your core temperature, the inside. Now I want to tell you right here that the core, sometimes think, oh, it's just right in here inside the trunk. No, it goes from the middle of your thighs to the top of your head, excludes the lower legs and your arms out there. That's what the core is about. When that temperature drops very many degrees at all, you're in serious trouble. And that's your biggest threat that you have. Whether it's whatever the emergency is that you face, hypothermia is the biggest threat when you're outside, in the winter, in the cold. Even if you're at home and the heat goes off for days and weeks, hypothermia is the biggest threat that you have. So when we think about hypothermia, I don't want you to be waiting until the event occurs. And there you are huddled around the thermostat in the dark, in the cold, saying, well, Martha, and now what are we going to do? Too late. You need to be preparing now for that so that if the heat is off, it's no big deal. Now some people say, well, that's simple, I have a wood-burning stove. If you have a wood-burning stove and you have a good supply of wood, that's okay. But most people don't and can't. A wood-burning stove is not the answer for most people because most people don't have one, can't have one. If they did have one, there isn't enough wood for them. And if there was enough wood and we were all trying to use it, would be dying from the air. So I'm not going to talk about something that will not work for everybody. If you have one, good. But if you don't have one, then there has to be a better solution. And that's what we're really talking about here because it's about personal warmth and clothing. See, the issue is not how do I keep my house warm? Does your house care whether it's warm or cold? Well, really the only thing that matters is if you still have water in your pipes and it freezes in there, that could be a problem. However, if the electricity is off, which will usually cause us to lose our heat for a period of time, you probably lost your water too if it's off for very long. Drain down your pipes, it's not a big deal. The house doesn't care, but it's about how do we take care of you. So it is about clothing and personal warmth. That's what we're going to talk about. All right, my purpose tonight in this area of winter and in the extremes is to move you from what I would call long-standing traditions and habits to something that is amazingly different. My bottom line would only take me 15 minutes. I could zip, zap, go to the bottom line, but the problem is some of you would wander out of here saying, boy, that is the goofiest thing I've ever heard. Nobody else does that. How could it be right if nobody else does it? Well, I want to give you enough information and give you some hope that you can do some spectacular things. Mostly, I want to help you miss the costly mistakes that cause misery, pain, suffering, and injury. So that's why I'll share with you these ideas. The importance of proper outdoor winter experiences. Now, somebody's going to panic and say, oh my heck, he's trying to get me to be a snow camper. I'm not interested in you becoming a snow camper. You don't have to do that. But I am here to tell you that you need to have some level of experience with these things. Well, what did we say changes your attitude about something? What's going to change your attitude about winter and cold so that it's no longer a threat? You know that you can be comfortable no matter what. It's going to be your knowledge changes that. How do you get knowledge? Well, the definition of knowledge is what? Information multiplied by experience. I can give you the information, but you are going to have to get the experience. And so I want to motivate you to go do those things. You do not have to be a snow camper. Some of the things that we're talking about, do them on your porch. Do them in your garage. Do them in your backyard. That is fine so that you will know that you can be okay if it's cold and you happen to be outside or just in a building or someplace where it's unheated and cold at that time. Here's the things about winter, why you want to do that. Number one, well, it requires more ingenuity. Do you remember when we talked in the first section about CPR? And one of those things, what was R? That was resourcefulness, ingenuity, resourcefulness. Those kind of sound like the same thing to me. They are. It teaches you tolerance and patience. In CPR, what was the P? Patience. If you're going to have to deal with some things that are a little tougher than normal, and you'll have to be patient with them. It will teach you patience. You can develop self-confidence for difficult situations. Winter is difficult for most people. And here's my bottom line. It's real simple. If you don't buy into any of those other things, I'm going to put it to you this way. Put it in the vernacular. Folks, winter happens. It happened last year to you, didn't it? Do you have any thought or concept that you will not experience winter this year? I mean, that's the bottom line. Most people are exposed to winter and cold and some level of snow and wind. And if you're going to be prepared for all kinds of situations you may be thrown into, you've got to be prepared for winter. It's as simple as that. And it brings us right back to this whole idea of knowledge. You've got to go do it. Knowledge is information multiplied by experience. Now, what I'm going to talk to you about is not a theory. None of this is theoretical. This comes directly from personal experience. It began a long time ago, and I'm not going to go through this whole list of things with you. My first snow camp was in 1957. It was not fun. It was miserable. And we snow camped for a number of years using the traditional way of doing things, with the same kind of traditional clothing and how you layered and did all those things. Boy, were those miserable experiences. But by 1962 is where the change began, and I'm going to talk to you about some of those changes. Here's a little thing. If you take a look at a newspaper clipping that was taken out a number of years ago, it says in there that Jim made all his clothes, his sleeping bag, and his shoes for under $100. He violated all the rules of traditional winter camping. You bet I violate the rules. Why? Because everybody that is using the traditional rules is freezing their heinies off out there, and it hurts. We got tired of that. So I break all the traditional rules. I break traditions. I do not break the rules of physics and the laws of nature. That's the difference. Well, here's the first trick. I want to fast forward a little bit. 1962, we started learning how to do some spectacular things. By 1968, my dad and I had wanted to go on the ultimate winter camp. And I was leaving the university at that time and going into the Navy in the Vietnam War. And it was time to go do what we had talked about for years, and that was to go snow camping in Alaska. And then the thought was, well, heck, if we're going to Alaska in February, why don't we just keep going north? We found out you could just get a plane ticket and ride up to Point Barrow, Alaska. That's 600 miles north of the Arctic Circle. And right there's the frozen ocean. We just go out there and camp on the polar sea. We thought that'd be terrific, so we did. And here we are getting ready to leave home at that time. We have a backpack for ourselves, for each one of us, and for our dog. And then we got on the plane and we ended up in, this next picture is in San Francisco. And we're in our full Arctic gear. Now, I tell you that for a reason, because when we got on that plane, we were dressed for the Arctic. Now, we looked a little strange, and some people looked at us strange when we were doing that. But we were comfortable enough to do that. Now, just put that aside for a moment. I'll come back to that. By the time we reached Point Barrow, Alaska, and walked off of that plane, it took us a few days to get there, it was 30 below zero. The wind was blowing slightly. And we just walked off the plane with the same clothing on. And the only thing I did after a little while is I put a hat on. Now, we were standing up there. We went into this little receiving area there, and they don't get very many snow campers up there, let me tell you. And we were strange. And those guys tried desperately to talk us into going home. That plane was parked out there on the tarmac, well, on the snowmac is what it was actually. There was no tar up there. It was parked out there, and they didn't turn the engines off on one side because you can't do that. That thing will shut down on you. Well, after 45 minutes, they couldn't get us to go home. The plane left. Then we asked them, I said, well, we need to go out on the polar sea. We want to go camping and set up our camp out there. How do we find the ocean? They said, well, just get out on the runway, walk off the end of the runway. So don't worry about getting hit by a plane. There won't be another one here for 4 days. Just walk off the end of the runway. You're on the beach, and shortly after that, that's the frozen sea. And as we're getting ready to go, they said, would you please line up so we can take your pictures? We don't think we'll ever find your bodies. They were serious. Those people were frightened of that place up there. So that was our picture standing out there. I gave them my camera and said, well, take a picture of me too. My dad, myself, and our dog out there. We went out, had a wonderful time, set up our camp out there, and then later on moved further out on the sea ice and a little closer back down towards the village in there because we wanted to be around the Eskimo people and learn from them. Beautiful, wonderful people, intelligent. They knew things we didn't know. But while we were there, it was very interesting. This other picture, these guys had come by on their dog teams. They heard about these guys that were out there from the lower 48 camping out there, and they'd come up to us, and we were building igloos out there, and they'd come by and they'd stop. And they're real quiet people, and they'd come up and they'd stand around for a minute, and they'd say, would you show me how to build one of those igloos? I've never seen one before. Now, people laugh about that, and they say, wait a minute, Eskimos, you see, the dome-shaped snow house we call the igloo comes from the eastern Greenland Canadian Eskimos. The Alaskan Eskimos never built them, and they hadn't seen any of them up there. So we had igloo building classes for the Eskimos in Alaska while we were up there. We also took the Boy Scout troop. There was a Boy Scout troop up there, and we asked the leaders and the boys, you guys must get a lot of snow camping in up here. I mean, this is a wonderful snow camp. They're going like, we don't snow camp. The leaders who were from the lower 48 were frightened of that place up there. They didn't know how to deal with it. See, their attitude wouldn't allow them to go. So we took the Point Barrow Boy Scout troop snow camping up there for the first time they'd been out there camping like that. We did things like that. There's a picture of our one igloo set up there. A beautiful place to be, incredible place out there. You can see the curvature of the earth and that frozen ocean out there. Low sun just up on the horizon. Marvelous place to be if you're warm, comfortable, and dry. We were up there for 3 weeks. The highest temperature we saw the entire time was 10 below zero for a high. We stayed out there in it. As I was getting ready to leave, standing on top of the igloo as a farewell. And then, in less than 48 hours, underneath the palm trees in Los Angeles, we were actually sleeping on a park bench because we were broke. We were out of money. Then we stayed outside. But I want you to know we were in the same Arctic clothing. Remember that if you would. In 1971, I nearly lost my life to hypothermia. Nearly froze to death out there. Came very, very close. In fact, the fact was I was too ignorant to die. If I'd known how much trouble I was in and didn't have some of the skills that I have now, I may not have made it. But it was a wonderful experience for me, once it was over, by the way, because I came very, very close. I probably had a core temperature, knowing the symptoms now and where I was, because on the 4th day in this trip, it was one of those things. I went camping. This was into Jackson Hole, Wyoming, across Ginny Lake, up into the foothills of the Teton Mountains, a beautiful place to go. In January, it's supposed to be cold up there. I thought it was supposed to be cold. It's one of those warm spells. You know, it's like 30 degrees, 28 degrees, snowing real heavily. And I didn't have this clothing that I'm going to talk to you about. I was using traditional layering of cotton and wool kinds of things, and I had a down sleeping bag. Nearly cost me my life out there in those warm, wet temperatures. Core temperature after I stopped shivering probably was down around 84, 85 degrees. I should have been in a coma, but I was tough and I was ignorant about how much trouble I was in, and I was responsible for my friend that I got out there, and I was focused on getting him out of there, and we made it out. Another story at another time. I learned some things about hypothermia from that. Let me tell you about another interesting experience. Now, as I tell you these things, this is not about bringing light on me. I want to bring light on the idea and the concept. I want you to learn from me. It's not about, oh, look at all the neat things this guy's done. Isn't he cool? No, I'm just a guy who's been very fortunate to do some unusual things, and I love sharing these ideas with people. So let me tell you about another interesting experience. I was given this challenge by a newspaper, because I'd been talking to them kind of like I'm talking to you. No fire, no shelter. In winter, no waterproofing. If you get yourself damp and wet, you self-dry, those kinds of things. And we were in this 2-hour interview, and they said, you know, one of them asked me a question. Says, wait a minute. She says, you mean you could get yourself wet in the winter and you'd be okay? And I said, yeah. And later on in this talking, one of them says, wait a minute, you mean if it was really cold like in the winter and you'd get yourself really completely wet and you wouldn't get hurt, you wouldn't die? And I said, I'd be okay. And then one of them asked, you know, the intensity of the questions are building. One of them asked, he says, now wait a minute. He says, do you mean if it was below zero, you got yourself soaking, wringing wet, that you would make it? And I said, I'd be okay. And at the very end, the editor-in-chief looked at me and he says, Jim, I got to ask you a straightforward question. Do you mean to tell me that using this clothing and the way that you do things and you teach people, that you could get yourself absolutely wringing wet below zero, spend the night, no change of clothing, no fire, no shelter, stay out there and you wouldn't die? And I said, no, I'd be okay. He said, that's incredible. we'd love to do a story on you. And then, I remember these words very well, and then he looked at me and he says, you know what? He says, that'd make a marvelous story, and it doesn't make any difference whether you live or die. It'll still be a good story. I said, thank you, I think. So anyway, this is what we did. This is February. Went down to one of our frozen lakes, chopped a hole in the ice. Now then, there's 18 inches of ice on the lake. Took me about 4 hours to chop a hole in that thing. And the water temperature is 32 degrees, and the air temperature is about 8 degrees. There's a slight breeze blowing, and I have my funny, goofy-looking homemade clothing on that I crawl down in this hole in the ice with no waterproofing on that thing. Now, we missed an opportunity. Didn't have a video camera back then, because, boy, was that an experience, at least to capture the audio, because I didn't say anything bad, but I'll tell you what, boy, do you hoot and holler, and when that water, I'll tell you what, when 32-degree water runs in against my skin, it hurts like blue blazes. I'm not telling you there's something magic in this. I'm telling you this hurt. I want you to understand that, because this is not one of those things you could do. This is one of those experiences that you know that on the TV when they show you all the daredevils and things, they say, this is done by trained professionals, never do this at home. No, this is a stupid idea. Only an idiot would do this. Don't do this. Okay, well, I let myself down in that hole in the ice, and I'm sink down into this thing in this funny, goofy, homemade clothing in there, and I spent 15 minutes in that water. Now, I want you to know that if you're in standard clothing and you're in there 4 or 5 minutes, you're getting into serious trouble, and 10 or 15 minutes later, you're in a coma and you're gone. So I was in there 15 minutes. I drove myself into hypothermia. I'm curious. I've never done this before. Yeah, and I don't really want to do it again either. But I wanted to know what would happen. If you think this is a fun experience, take a look at the grimace on my face. I am trying to smile. Boy, that's a hard one to smile in. Anyway, got out of the water. If the water runs in, no waterproofing the clothing, so it runs in. Guess what? It'll run out. And then if it runs out, it replaces it with air. We're getting the insulation back. So I just squeezed the water out of this stuff, stayed in that clothing. No fire, no shelter, did not take the clothing off or change clothing. Later on that night, went to bed in a sleeping bag, made exactly the same way that the clothing is, and I did not take my clothing off. I stayed in my clothing. Why? Well, if I'm wringing wet out there and I'm in hypothermia and I undress at 8 degrees or whatever it was, this is not going to help my situation. The other thing is, what's my clothing going to be like in the morning when I go to put it back on? I'm going to have an ice pick. There'll be no way to get it back on, and I'm not going to want to put that stuff on. But you see, a standard sleeping bag, they don't want you to go to bed with any moisture in your clothing. Why? Because it builds up inside of your sleeping bag, and then you end up with ice in your sleeping bag. Been there, done that one too. That's no fun. A sleeping bag made the same way that we make our clothing has an amazing property in that you can get the moisture out of it. This is what it was like in the morning. It was kind of a long night because most of the night I was hot and humid. It was like sleeping in a steam bath in there. But in the morning, my clothing was dry. Now, not 100%. There was still a little bit of dampness in it if I grabbed a sleeve and squeezed on it, because I could feel a little dampness in it, but I wasn't wringing wet anymore. And I got up and was inactive, and the rest of the moisture just escaped from my clothing. We're talking about moisture management here that's unique in anything that I know of. I don't know of a better way. Now, the sleeping bag is now damp. Sleep in it one more night and it goes dry. You see, we have capability that's beyond what you're used to. Well, there's been some other tests done out there working with the military. This is Fort Greely, Alaska, and we're out there, we're putting men into a cold chamber. Even though it's February up there, we put them in a cold chamber so we can test them at 60 below zero. They have thermocouples all over their body. We put them inside of this cold chamber, and they're running off a comparison between what they call the ECWEC system, the extreme cold weather clothing system, that's layered up with fleeces and insulates and things like that, and Gore-Tex and those types of things. And they put their men in there and that, and we put our men, well, we put their men and our stuff in there, and then run this test. And I noticed one thing about this test. I looked at the test protocol and I said, asking the colonel there in charge of this, I said, why is this test only supposed to go for 2 hours? And he looked at me with kind of an incredulous look and he said, well, nobody can ever stay in the chamber as long as 2 hours. Why would we want to test longer than that? Okay, fine. After 45 minutes, they pulled the first man out in their 60 below zero clothing that they had. 45 minutes, he actually had a cold injury, had a little bit of frostbite on his shins in there. By the time the hour was up, all 4 of the men in ECWEX had been pulled out of that chamber. The folks that were in the PALS clothing for Phillips Arctic Living System stayed in there until 2 hours was up. And then they asked them, how long could you guys stay in there? And they said, well, all night. We don't care. We're just bored. It's a little room. They're sitting in there on a bench. And so they had to come out because they said the test would end, but nobody got cold sitting at 60 below zero in that chamber. And the comment that they had made, and those men were wearing what the Army had as their 60 below zero boots on their 60 below zero clothing. And the comment I listened to the test people say as they were talking among themselves, they said, boy, that's the first time we've ever seen warm feet at 60 below zero. These people still had normal foot temperatures. All the other men's foot temperatures had plummeted down into the 40s for temperatures, which is a lot of pain. Well, had a lot of fun out in the field with those folks. But other things that we have done, the military's been a fun one to play with because it's allowed me to go to some very unusual places and be out with the Marines, the Army, the Air Force, all of these folks. Another one was above the Arctic Circle, very quickly taking some tests. And here we are, thermocouples taped all over our bodies. This is 1,000 miles north of the Arctic Circle. We're up there to do one thing, and that is to test and compare between standard clothing and what everybody else uses and what we're doing, but now get some scientific evidence, something that we can measure. Because I was under a research contract with another company, and they were paying for this stuff, and that was a lot of fun. This is an engineer's dream. You get paid to do research and have fun while you're camping at the same time. What a ball. We did that. Well, if you take a look here, I've got thermocouples coming out all over my body so we could take these readings and out around the feet and down on the toes. And on that particular trip, when I'm in there, in this case, in the ECWEC system, I suffered both frostbite and hypothermia out there after 4 days, and then fortunately changed back into our funny homemade stuff, and then my core temperatures recovered very quickly. It was amazing, and I have some good data on those things. Other testing that we have done with our own cold boxes, testing footwear and different equipment, has been both fun and educational, but it's allowed us to show what they will and will not do. You take a look at this vapor barrier boot, which is a common boot. It has its place out there, but we understand what it will and will not do. This thing is rated as a 60 below zero boot. Another boot that's a very common one, you take a look at the Sorel, and these are snowpacks out there. I want you to understand, I'm not here to pick on something. I'm not here trying to slam dunk on something, but I'm going to give you what the facts are. I will tell you, and I can back up anything that I say. I can back it up scientifically, and I can back it up with evidence, and empirical evidence out there in the cold and in the winter. So it's all provable. But here's one of these things right here, 40 below zero boot. Their own hang tag says 40 below zero out there. Well, I'm not impressed with their 40 below zero hang tag that they have. As a matter of fact, let me show you a real 40 below zero boot. It looks like this. And we've done some simple things through the years, and you can make your own stuff out there. Or this one, a boot that I designed. This is an honest, a 60 below zero boot, no question about it. Warmest footwear in the world. I'll talk to you about how and why it works. You can make this kind of stuff. Here's the kind of thing that you can make. And it's looked different. You take a look at this picture here. That's my dad standing in this funny homemade Powell's clothing, standing at Wolf Creek Pass, Colorado. It's a nice sunny day at that time. The nighttime temperatures were probably 20 or 30 below zero. And during the day, it looked like it was a warm day. It was probably up into 15 degrees, something like that, 20 degrees. We will show you how to make your own mittens, how to make all of this kinds of stuff you can have a lot of fun with. Or it can look really, really nice. But I'm going to tell you something about style. Style is being warm at 40 below zero, no matter what it looks like. That's what I consider style to be. Well, a quote from some other people. I've been talking about myself a little bit, and again, not to bring light on me, but light on the idea and the concept that we share with you. Oliver Wood, he was the director of photography for Die Hard 2, and on that one we outfitted them with this Powell's equipment, and this is what he said after using it. I've worked in all weather conditions, and I can tell you that cold weather has always been my biggest fear. Since working in your outfits, I fear no more. They can send me to the North Pole and it wouldn't worry me. It was a new experience for everybody not having cold feet. One of the guys fell through the ice and he stayed warm in his outfit even though wet. Another one, I had the opportunity back in the mid-'80s to train an outfit. Jim Lovell, commander of Apollo 13, and he went on a North Pole expedition a private expedition out there using the PALS equipment and clothing. This is what he said. His cold weather protection system, PALS clothing, unlike any other available, is capable of providing indefinite protection in the most severe cold weather known to man. And in 1989, Popular Science gave to me an award, one of their 100 greatest achievements in science and technology for this clothing system. And that was a fun thing to do, and I appreciated that very much. Now, finally, somebody's going to say, finally, somebody's going to tell me what to buy. Well, not quite. But now we'll take a break. What I love doing is sharing how to do these things. But a very important part of how is why do they work? How and why do they work? Now my challenge is, in this evening and the time that we have, I don't have enough time to cover all the details. What it is, I've done a course and I've taught it for years. It's called Winter Without Worries. Winter Without Worries, when we put everything together, takes about 20 hours. We'll have it all published. I'm giving you the tip of the iceberg, but some very important principles that you can get started with. As a matter of fact, already you know more than we knew when we started, because we had to figure all this stuff out from scratch. So I want to give you hope that you can learn to do these things. Now the principle is real simple. This is what we're trying to deal with. We just want to understand what the laws of nature, the laws of physics are. And if you will obey the laws, the results are wonderful. So that's all that we're going to do. Here's the very simplest part of the laws. We want to simply retain body heat and release moisture. That's it. The whole thing boils down to that. In terms of cold weather and winter, we're trying to retain the heat and get rid of the moisture. Everything that I do is aimed at accomplishing those two things. Now then, well, why clothing? Why not something else? Here's things, and again, I'm not trying to pick on something. I want to tell you the reality, because there's lots of folks that have things in their emergency kits, and there's a lot of traditions and a lot of things that float around that people say, oh, you do this and you'll be just great. We'll try it and find out if you will. Now, here's some neat little things that you should have, but you have to understand what the limits are. You've got little things like this. You've maybe seen these little heat packs. What do? You take them and you put them in boiling water. That melts the crystals in here. It's now a liquid, and they have this little disc in there that you snap it. And this is a very saturated, a super saturated solution, and then it goes into crystals, and the crystalline process in this case is an exothermic reaction. It gives off heat, and so they heat up, and you can use them again and again, because you'll take and boil it and melt them down again, and you can do it again. You say, boy, you ought to have a bunch of these in your emergency kit, and then if your fingers are just about numb out there because it's like zero and your hands are frozen, boy, you could get some of these things out, snap the little disc and put them down in your pockets, your sleeping bags, your coat, your mittens, and warm up your fingers. Guess what? These things self-trigger at about 17 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you've had them in your cold pack in there, they've already gone off, given off their heat, and they won't do you any good. You have to know what the limits are, how and why things work. Then there's these little heat packs, these little warm packs. And this is the one, you know, where you rip open the bag there and shake it up and get some air in it. And what it is, it's a rusting process. It's just an iron burner. And when iron rusts quickly, it gives up a little bit of heat. And so these are nice little things. They get warm. You say, boy, I ought to have 100 of those things. And then my emergency kit, and probably some of you are going like, I got 100 of them. I wonder what the problem is. I'll tell you what the problem is. They have a shelf life. They have a practical, realistic shelf life of about 2 years. So if you've had one in your survival pack for the past 10 years, and you say, boy, when it's cold, I'm going to rip it open and use that thing, guess what? It's probably dead. And so if you were dependent on that to save your fingers, you're going to lose them. See, these are fire-based. We've got to do it another way, some way that's very, 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 very reliable. That's what we're looking at. So let's talk about insulation. It's the truth about insulation. Well, I brought a material with me. It's a little white, puffy material. Looks like cotton, but it's not. This is a material called Qualofill. It's an all polyester, 100% synthetic. It's been used, you find it in a lot of sleeping bags and coats and parkas and mittens and things, and there's other things very similar to it out there. So my question to you is this. Here we have this white puffy material. Is this insulation? Is this stuff insulation? What do you think? Okay, I see some heads shaking. I see some puzzled looks, and some guys are going like, I don't know, I'm not going to raise my hand on this one. It's kind of like, listen, when you got some smart aleck instructor, you know, what are they going to ask you? They're going to ask you some question. No matter what you say, you're going to be wrong. It's a zinger. Well, I'm not really trying to do that, but I want to be sure that you understand how and why things work, because if you understand how they work, you can take care of the problem. So rather than asking you, is this insulation, let me ask you something that I think most of you already know. What is it in this that actually insulates you? What is it? Air. Thank you. That's it. Air. It's actually the air that's the insulation. This white puffy stuff we call qualifill, is that insulation? Actually, it's not. A solid block of polyester plastic is not a very good insulator. As a matter of fact, it's very dense. It's just not a good insulator. But you spin it and puff it up into all these little fibers and surround it with all this trapped air, and guess what? We call it insulation. But I'd like you to understand that actually the only thing that we are going to use for clothing insulation is air. Trapped, stabilized, dry, non-moving, dead airspace. All of those parameters are very simple. It's just little pockets of air that doesn't move, keep it dry. Simple as that. So we can use a material like this. There's a lot of different materials that you could use, but I'd like you to understand that it's just air that we're going to use. So here's the very simple things that I'll tell you about insulation in clothing. First off, it's actually only air. That's all we're going to use, just air. The other thing is, folks, there is no heat in insulation. No heat in the insulation. Where's the heat? The heat's in you, right? The job of the insulation is trap the heat and keep it in. Remember, we're trying to retain heat. That's the job of the insulation. The other thing I'd like you to understand is that there is no magic in insulation. And in spite of what somebody's trying to tell you, it's really only just air. That's all that we're using. Somebody always says, well, then how come that stuff's so darned expensive? Well, I don't know, ask them. It's just air, that's all that we want to use. Just different ways of trapping the air. Now then, if it's really just air, and we're just going to trap a certain amount of air around us, I want you to understand that it's really just a matter of thickness. It's what I'm going to call the air equivalent thickness. Not the thickness of material, but it's the amount of air that's in the material, or the equivalent thickness of air, that determines whether you're going to have adequate insulation or not. So what is the thickness of trapped, stabilized, dry, non-moving air that you need to have on so that you can live in Arctic conditions and be okay? Click. Half the people in the audience went, crazy man in the front of the room goes to the Arctic. I'm smarter than that. So you're thinking, I don't need to understand Arctic. I'm here to tell you, you do. How many people think you have been exposed to Arctic conditions? A few people say, yeah. Let me ask you this. How many people have been in the past or may yet be exposed to 0 degrees Fahrenheit? And throw a little wind in on top of it. Man, that is true Arctic. And you can be hurt, injured, or killed in a very short period of time if you're not properly protected. You need to understand Arctic. So with that out of the way, most people in this country, it may only be for a few hours a day, one night in the middle of winter, it may be Arctic. But if you were outside caught in it, it could cost you your life. So you need to understand Arctic. All right. How much air do you have to have surrounding your body? What thickness of air must you surround yourself with? You need to surround yourself with 1 inch of trapped, stabilized, dry, non-moving air. Not material, but air is what it comes down to. Now then, one thing very, very quickly that I'd like to bring up, because I would like to kind of debunk something. There's a lot of information going around. No, there's a lot of marketing. I don't know if it's information, but there's a lot of things being said about that you can get yourself a thin insulation. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. Not really, not reliably, not long periods of time. Thin insulation will get you into trouble. You really do have to have a thickness. As a matter of fact, the negative word that the industry uses, well, you don't want to have bulky clothes on. Hooey, I want to have bulky clothes on. I want to surround myself with thickness of air, because if I don't, I can't guarantee that I'll be okay. This is kind of the way that I put it, very, very simply, is this. If you want to stay warm, then look fat. And people go, oh, darn, That's not socially acceptable. I'm going to tell you, you are who you are, you look the way you are, you're beautiful, you're fine, there's nothing wrong with that. And what I mean by look fat is, whatever you are, start with that, and you're going to have add thickness to that, about an inch surrounding you. If you will do that where it's all air, not material, you'll be just fine. And you say, but I just don't want to look fat. I'm just not comfortable with that. Let me give you your choices. This is what you can do. One, move someplace where it's warm. If you don't want to move, like Hawaii, you know, where it never freezes, you'll be okay there. If you don't want to move there, your other choice is freeze. But please be quiet about it. Don't want to hear about it. That's your choices. The rules are simply this. You've got to insulate yourself adequately or you'll be cold. Simple as that. You must do that. Okay. Would you like to know what the worst possible clothing insulation looks like? That you could, if you had to find the worst, make the worst, build the worst, own it, manufacture it, would you like to know what it is? And why would you want to know? Yeah, stay away from it. Don't buy it, don't sell it, whatever it is. I'll show you what it looks like, folks. It looks like this. See these things right here? You couldn't invent anything worse than this. And I'm not playing with you. I am being very, very serious. I mean, we do chuckle, and I hope you do, but I don't want you to forget. And you say, I got a whole bunch of those in my emergency stuff. I know. Do you know what these are good for? Rags. That's it. These make wonderful rags. They make great diapers. Any of those kinds of things. But they will cost you your life if you're in an emergency situation. These things could hurt you. Don't try and use them. You say, now, why is that? I mean, golly. Well, first off, what is this material? Let me take a look at it in a couple of ways. Let's talk about how much air is in these things. Well, if you pick them up and you take a look at it and you say, boy, I don't know, that's pretty, well, there's some thickness there. What does it weigh? And let's grab up another wad of insulation right here. This has gotten kind of hammered and flattened down, but I'll tell you what, it's a pretty nice little puffy pile if we loosen it up a little bit. And this would almost go as big as that. Which one do you think weighs the most? Let me give you a test. How do you tell if something has a lot of air in it? Now, there's got to be some kind of an engineer in the audience, right? And so we ask a very technical question of an engineer, and my question is this: how much does air weigh? And the answer is, don't give me mole weights or one of those things out there. Just give me a simple answer: not much. That's a good answer. So if we want to have clothing that is mostly full of air, that's all that we're trying to insulate with is air. It's a little bit of material that's puffed up and full of air. And if it's going to be thick and it doesn't weigh much, it's mostly full of air. That's what you want. So we're not looking for heavy winter clothing. We're looking for fat, light clothing, which means they have a lot of air in them. So that's one thing about these. If I wanted to have on an inch air equivalent thickness of these things, do you know how thick it would have to be? About 3 inches. How many pair is that? I don't know, 30. If you had 30 pair and put them on, could you move? You can't. So you put on 3 pair of them, maybe 4, jam yourselves into them, go outside, you have an air equivalent thickness of around 1/16 of an inch, you go outside 15 minutes, you turn it into a popsicle and you say, man, the weather's bad today. Folks, I'm here to tell you something. There's no such thing as bad weather, but there is bad clothing. The weather's just fine. It will be what it's going to be. But if you have bad clothing on, you can be in trouble. So you see, the biggest problem we have with this then, it doesn't have a lot of air in it, but what's the other problem? What's it made out of? Cotton. Cotton is a hot weather material as far as insulation goes. Use it in the hot. It's a wicking material. It picks up your perspiration and then allows it to evaporate, cool away from you. That's wonderful in July. It's lousy in January. This stuff is a wonderful wick, and it picks up and holds moisture tenaciously. Now, we talk about the materials that you can use in insulation. Well, let's take a look. You have 2 groups. You have the natural and you have the synthetic. Now, what are the naturals? The naturals happen to be what? Cotton. Cotton, you have down, and you have wool.